¿Qué tal? Bienvenidos a una edición más de MesaUP. En esta ocasión tenemos una edición especial, ya que contamos con la presencia de George Loewenstein, Herbert A. Professor of Economic and Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University, quien conversará con Oswaldo Molina, profesor del Departamento de Economía e investigador del Centro de Investigación de la UP. Adelante, Oswaldo.
Professor Loewenstein, it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you, and here in all the university we are very glad for your visit. So thank you for this interview.
It's wonderful for me to be here.
For those who are new to behavioral economics, what would you say is the most substantial novelty behavioral economics brings to the table?
Well, I mean, behavioral economics integrates psychology and economics. And I think some people think it's really about people being biases or errors that people make, but it's really more about bringing a richer, I mean, economics is based on a foundation of rational choice of human behavior. And behavioral economics enriches that foundation with insights from psychology. I mean, personally, I think behavioral economics is a lot more fun to practice than kind of traditional economics. It basically is an excuse for doing research on whatever you want to do.
Good answer. Behavioral economics has certainly gained presence in the last, 40 years in the economics field. How do you see behavioral economics in the next decade?
Well, a friend of mine, Matthew Rabin, and also a co-author on various papers, he once said that he thought that success for behavioral economics would be when it ceases to exist, because traditional economics has so much incorporated insights from behavioral economics. That's not my view at all. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of introducing of the psychology that we can introduce into the field. And so, and I think even in 10, 20, 30 years, that will still be the case. So I think we're going to continue to thrive, and there's so much psychology that can be still drawn upon. I think, for example, I think people are at all levels of the income distribution, people are just very focused on ego and self-esteem. Mm-hmm. And that insight goes back to Adam Smith. He basically said that economic activity isn't about kind of bettering yourself materially. It's really about ego, about feeling good about yourself. And that's just one of many, many different ideas that behavioral economics hasn't yet adequately incorporated.
And you think in the near future, behavioral economics can do it?
I think I think it's going to be good in the near future, and in the far future. I think there's an almost unlimited body of psychological work that behavioral economics can integrate. I also think that there's a huge scope for something that hasn't happened all that much yet, and that is for economists to contribute to psychology. Huh. And a lot of my own research has been focused on that, like bringing some of the methods, the theoretical modeling methods, the empirical methods to bear on issues that are kind of traditionally covered by psychologists. An example is boredom. I'm very interested in boredom, maybe because I'm extremely prone to it myself, but I think that I've been doing some work modeling the theoretical underpinnings of boredom. And so that would be an example of an economist working on a topic that's traditionally covered by psychologists.
Yeah, and in fact you work with psychologists. How do they take behavioral economics?
I think there's very many different types of behavioral economics, and I think they're more receptive to some types than others. I publish about equally in economics and psychology, and I think a lot of psychologists don't, they consider me an economist, and the economists consider me a psychologist. So neither group thinks that I'm part of their group.
No, come on. Some of your research deals with the value of information in this new era. In particular, you propose a new economics of information. Mm-hmm. Tell us, please, about it.
Okay, well, in the 1960s, George Stigler, who was actually, I was his colleague for about 5 years. He was a remarkable man, but he kind of initiated the economics of information, and that was based on the idea that the value of information is that it helps you to make better decisions, and that's the only value of information. And then in the 1970s, well, before the 1970s, but different economists like George Akerlof, Michael Spence, they initiated what has been referred to as the new economics of information, and that is the idea that a lot of different things stem from the fact that different people have possessed different information. So, for example, if you buy a new car, when you drive it off the lot, it immediately loses a lot of its value, and that's because you, as the owner, know a lot about the car.
Indeed.
But a prospective buyer doesn't know what you know, and they're going to be afraid, and so they're going to be reluctant to buy it from you, and that reduces the price. That's part of the new economics of information. It's sometimes referred to as the lemons problem.
Indeed.
But all of the work in the new economics of information retained Stigler's idea that the only value of information is its ability to help you make better decisions. And I'm very interested in the idea that information carries utility. It carries pleasures and pains entirely apart from its indirect impact on making better decisions. And so if you hear bad news, like if you hear that one of your children is having a problem, that's going to make you feel really bad. Or if you are honored at a university in Peru, that's going to make you feel good. And that's good. Information has direct effects on utility. And so that's part of the new economics of information. But also, there's a bunch of different motives relating to information, like, for example, curiosity. Curiosity is the desire for information for its own sake, specifically not because it helps you to make better decisions. And curiosity is an enormously important motivation in society, like when you think about things like academia.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, that's right. Or like student performance, or another, in many cases, there's information that would help us to make better decisions, but we don't want to get it because we're afraid of the news. And so there's a lot of motivated information avoidance, and that would never be predicted by Stigler's notion of when and why we value information. So the new economics of information, I mean, I've proposed this term, it hasn't really caught on yet. I guess that's negative information for me, but the new economics of information just introduces a much richer conception of when and why we seek or avoid information.
No, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. Okay, but what inspired your research on persuasion and belief defense? understanding how people defend their beliefs can shed light on communication strategies in various fields, like marketing or so on.
This kind of relates to the economics of beliefs. And on my doctoral committee, I had one psychologist. It was two economists and one psychologist, and his name was Bob Abelson. And he wrote a paper titled "Beliefs Are Like Possessions."
Wow, wow.
And of course, if somebody tries to take our possessions away from us, we become very defensive, possibly aggressive. And so I've been doing some work that kind of follows up on Abelson's perspective. And the idea is that we treat our beliefs as if they're possessions, sometimes even as if they're children, and we defend them against perceived attackers. So one of the projects I'm working on is with a former graduate student named David Hagman, who's now at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And we kind of established what we call the drawbridge model of persuasion. And so if you have particular beliefs that you cherish for some reason, maybe because they're connected to your identity, and someone approaches you, or it could be a newspaper, a media, and you get the idea that they're going to challenge your beliefs. And since you hold your beliefs as possessions, you want to defend them. And the drawbridge model says that when you think that you're about to get persuaded, that someone's going to try to persuade you out of one of your cherished beliefs, you raise the drawbridge, and so you become very impervious to persuasion. So in one of the early studies that we ran on this topic, we had somebody approach another person and try to persuade them of something, but we kind of randomized people into two experimental conditions, and half the time before they started, they were very unthreatening. Like they said, well, I might be wrong about this, but here's my perspective. And on the other one, in the other condition, they were very confident and aggressive. Like, I absolutely know that this is the right answer. And the surprising finding was that the persuaders who were more kind of meek or tentative ended up shifting the positions of the persuadees more, even though you might think that if they were more tentative, they'd be less persuasive, but it was exactly the opposite, which is what we predicted with the drawbridge model.
Oh, interesting. And this defending your beliefs sounds like, I don't know, the current political situation in the world.
It's been very surprising. A lot of, the current political developments have certainly inspired my research, but I would say also that the current political situation, of course, the huge amount of belief polarization has really provided new motivation for some of the work I've been doing for some time.
You were talking about how your research are related with the curiosity. Mm-hmm. What are some key features of curiosity that your research has identified?
Mm-hmm. So I think in 1994 I proposed what I called an information gap theory of curiosity. And that theory says that when we become aware of a gap in our knowledge, and we know what that gap is, and then we start to experience something that's a little bit like hunger. Like hunger, we don't have food and we'd like to have food, and if hunger feels bad, and then when you eat, it feels better. Some philosopher said that hunger is the best spice. Mm-hmm. Well, the information gap theory of curiosity says that curiosity is very much like a drive. It's like for example, hunger. And in this paper, the 1994 paper, I think it's titled The Psychology of Curiosity, And I talk about some of the essential features of curiosity. And one of them is that curiosity can be amazingly intense. Like it can powerfully motivate us, even though by definition, curiosity is about things that have no material gain to us. Another is that curiosity can be very stimulus dependent. Like we might be very curious about, have you ever walked down the street and you're walking behind someone and you think maybe they're dressed strangely and you think, what do they look like from the other side? And let's say, and you're very curious, so maybe you kind of walk fast and then kind of glance backwards, right?
Yeah, indeed.
But let's say that you don't do that and the person turns the corner and disappears. Within seconds, your curiosity dissipates. So curiosity is very stimulus dependent. And a third feature of curiosity is that the pleasure that you get from curiosity is often, from getting the information that you're curious about, is often pretty minimal compared to the intensity of your drive to get the information in the first place. And Sigmund Freud actually had a theory of curiosity. He believed that curiosity was derivative of the sex drive, which I think is kind of an absurd idea. But if you think about it, curiosity does have a lot of the same features as the sex drive.
Okay.
Like for example, the sex drive is very stimulus dependent, right?
Yeah, indeed.
And you can judge whether the third property of curiosity, how much pleasure you get from actually satisfying it, is similar to curiosity.
So it's a way to say that becoming academics can be sexy.
I couldn't have put it better.
Okay. How does belief utility influence decision makings in every life? Understanding the concept of can help individuals navigate their beliefs and the information they choose to accept or reject.
Mm-hmm. Well, belief-based utility is the idea that we get utility or pleasure and pain not only from what we consume, from how much leisure we get, which are the typical things that economists focus on, but our pleasure or pain at any point in time depend tremendously on what our beliefs are. And probably the most important beliefs are beliefs about ourselves. I mentioned ego, like am I a good person, am I good looking, am I a nice person? And so again, because beliefs have such a direct impact on our utility, in many cases, we are motivated to avoid information. And that can have major consequences for decision making.
Sure.
And today I'm going to be talking about some research on the ostrich effect. And we look at investors who have portfolios, and what we find is when the stock market goes up, they're much more likely to log into their accounts. Yeah. And because when the stock market goes up, it's always possible that your portfolio went down, you made bad choices, but most of the time when the stock market goes up, your portfolio goes up.
Sure.
And so that's a situation where people anticipate that they're going to get good information, and so they seek it. But when the stock market goes down and they think, oh, if I look, it's going to be bad information, then they don't log into their investment provider and look up their portfolio.
Quite interesting. It's incredible how your research explains us what we are doing every single day.
Even though I study this phenomenon and know about it, I still find myself doing it.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. In fact, actually, I have an extra motive, which is I want to support my own theory.
Okay, well, some perhaps one of the present issues in society currently is corruption, at least in countries like Peru.
Yes.
It's quite important. What insights from behavioral economics can be useful to address this problem?
I mean, corruption is a little bit like Humpty Dumpty. That
Let's talk about that.
okay. It's much, if you're in a country that's not corrupt, it's much easier to maintain a lack of corruption. Once things become very corrupt, it's very difficult to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And more and more people are themselves corrupt, and they want to protect themselves, and they want to protect their colleagues, and it's just, it's very difficult. So, I mean, I guess one insight would be, don't go down that slippery slope. I'm very worried about these kinds of things happening in the United States as well with the recent election. But I think something else about corruption, there's something very depressing about corruption. I think people really like to live in a meritocracy. They really like, and things like corruption and also nepotism they're just demoralizing.
Yeah, indeed.
And it's hard to motivate yourself in those situations. And so I think you both miss out on a lot of prosperity because people think, what's the point of work? What's the point of working hard if hard work isn't what's going to get me ahead? It's who I know, or what kind of bribes am I taking, what political position I'm in. So it's very demotivating, but also it's very immiserating. And so you can have a country that's very beautiful, that is very, the food is fantastic.
It sounds familiar.
Yeah. There's all sorts of amazing archaeological sites. And
which country can be that?
And so you would expect the people to be really happy in this country, but corruption is just demoralizing.
Yes.
I haven't looked at it myself, probably somebody else has, but if you look at surveys of well-being across countries, I would expect that there's a huge impact of corruption on well-being.
I bet on that, yes, indeed. Okay, well, some closing questions. What would you say for our student in economics and finance about doing research in general?
Well, number one, you should be doing behavioral economics. But number two, which is actually a little bit related, it's so important. Intrinsic motivation is so important. And you should be researching not kind of what's popular at this moment, what's like if you're a PhD student, what you think you're more likely to publish in a good journal. In my opinion, you should be researching what you're interested in, like what you're personally really interested in, what gets you upset, what gets you excited. And when I was in graduate school, I knew some people some graduate students, some colleagues, who decided to study, for example, money and banking. Like, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with money and banking, but I just had the sense that their heart wasn't into it. And it's really, really difficult to do the day-to-day work on something for extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic motivation. Earlier I also mentioned, like, what are people curious about, going back to curiosity. The number one thing that people are curious about is something that you might think they know the most about, and that is themselves. People are really curious about themselves. And I think that research that has a kind of a autobiographical element that can be extremely intrinsically motivating for people. So yeah, study something where you're going to have a hard time dragging yourself away from the research, as opposed to a topic where you have a hard time getting yourself to do the research.
Oh, great piece of advice. Besides your research, what else are passionate about? How do you get your ideas of research? Or
Oh, I love your questions. Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of ideas from like reading the newspaper or personal conversations, but I would say that the number one source of ideas for me is novels and also biographies.
Really?
Yes, and I mean, novelists are really psychologists with an extra layer of talent. Yeah, they can get it down on paper, but I mean, some novels like arbitrarily, I'm thinking about like Anna Karenina or some of Dostoevsky's books, but I don't have a particular taste for Russian literature. But if you're a behavioral economist and you read those novels, like every page has like amazing psychological insights. And I think if we tapped the insights just from one novel, like let's say Anna Karenina, that would give us grist for behavioral economics for the next many decades.
Wow. Well, I love that book, by the way.
You do too.
Yeah,
okay. And it's enjoyable to read also.
Yeah,
so
of course.
It's a great way to get ideas.
Wonderful, wonderful. Talking about personal matters, I read you are a great grandson of Sigmund Freud. Is that true?
That is true. Sigmund Freud was, my mother was Sigmund Freud's, the daughter of Sigmund Freud's oldest son.
Wow. So, has that fact marked your path in any way? You just mentioned Sigmund Freud before, by the way.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have if it if I knew you were going to ask this question. Well, I'm a skeptic of a whole lot of Sigmund Freud's ideas, and I think he was a pretty terrible methodologist.
Okay.
He was an extreme example of seeing what he expected to see. And so I've personally been a big critic of Freud. I haven't written anything about that, but it has kind of shocked me in the decades of my career how often some of the ideas that I've come up with, when I think about it, end up resembling ideas of Sigmund Freud. Like, for example, he had the distinction between the id, the ego, and the superego. And I've done a lot of work on emotion, some work on ego, and so I guess maybe it's a genetic effect, or maybe it goes through my mother, who was a social worker. But as much as I'd like to deny it, I think that he certainly has had a big influence. And of course, just the legacy of being related to a famous person, it has some benefits, but it also definitely has some downsides.
Yeah, I can understand that. Okay, well, I don't know if there is anything else that you would like to add.
I guess just that it's been such a pleasure visiting your university and your country, and I'm so glad that collectively you gave me the opportunity to do both of those things.
Thank you for this interview. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this conversation, y muchas gracias a ustedes por acompañarnos en esta edición de MesaUP. Los esperamos a la próxima.